Hello and welcome. My name is Marcos and this is Self-Psychology. Now today we're going to talk about something a little complicated. So I'm going to ask that you try to follow, I'm going to try to be clear, and I'm going to use a couple of examples. Now remember, the examples I use are not real case examples and they're not about real people. They're just things I've made up to try to make this a little more clear. Now the topic I'm going to talk about today is secondary, well, as we call it in psychology, it's called secondary gain. But more clearly, what it is emotion as a distraction. Okay? Now think about this. A lot of people out there that look at my videos suffer from anxiety, suffer from depression, suffer from jealousy, guilt, shame, anger, all of these emotions, right? Now, what if that emotion that you're suffering from is just a distraction? A distraction for something deeper that's happening. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today, because one of the things I like to ask people often is, what if you didn't have the depression? What if you weren't angry? Then what would your life be like, right? Because if you weren't angry and having these outbursts and hitting people and getting arrested, then what would your life be like? And maybe sometimes there are other issues behind that that the person is really afraid to deal with or really depressed about, that doesn't come up until you talk about it, until you get past the anger. Now let me give you an example to see if this makes it clearer. There's a lady called Sarah, right? Now Sarah is anxious. She's afraid to leave her house. She's agoraphobic is what it's called. She's afraid to leave her house. She's afraid to get on the subway. Because if she gets on the subway, she's afraid that the subway is going to stop between stations and she's going to have an attack. She's going to have a panic attack and it's going to be horrible, and she's going to pass out and she's going to die. So she's afraid of leaving her house and getting on the subway. Now, that's her primary problem. That's her anxiety. That's her emotion. Right? But then I ask, what if you didn't have that anxiety? What if you were able to leave your house and get on the subway? Then what would your life be like? Well, then she says, well, I'll be working, I'll be exercising, I'll be visiting my friends, and I'll be visiting my family. And then she stops for a minute and says, oh my gosh, I haven't seen my mother in 2 years. So when I inquire more, it's like, well, I haven't seen my mother in 2 years because that's when she was diagnosed with cancer. And her body has been transforming because of this cancer. And it's been very difficult for her when we speak on the phone. So she starts to see that her anxiety about getting on the subway and stuff is just a distraction. Because if she weren't anxious, it's like her mind, her body is protecting her by making her anxious. Because if she weren't anxious, then she would go to visit her mother. And if she would go to visit her mother, then she would see her body transformed and her mind, and she would get depressed. And she's been depressed before, so she knows how horrible it is and how much suffering you go through when you're depressed. So Sarah doesn't want to get depressed. Her body, her mind, her subconscious doesn't want her to experience her mother. She wants her to avoid it. So how does her mind, her body do this? By making her anxious about leaving the house. Okay? You see how sometimes the anxiety or the depression or the emotion, whatever the emotion is, could be a distraction. Let me give you another example. There's Joe, a college student, right? Now Joe is depressed. He's in his college dorm and he doesn't leave his dorm. He stays in his room. He's always sleeping, smoking pot, doesn't go out of his room, doesn't eat well, doesn't sleep well, doesn't call his friends, doesn't do his homework, and he's about to get kicked out of college. Right? So when I asked, so Joe, what if you weren't depressed? What would your life be like? So he goes on to explain, well, I would be doing my schoolwork, I would be hanging out with my college buddies, and maybe even have a girlfriend. And that's when he realizes, wait a minute, this all started when I broke up with my last girlfriend, right? Because he thought, okay, let me back up a bit. He thought that he was depressed because his dog died, right? A month ago. But the fact is that he broke up with his girlfriend 6 months ago. So Joe started to feel depressed after his girlfriend broke up with him. But then he came out of the depression and he was fine and he was going to class. And then his dog dies and then he gets into this really deep, major depression. So when I asked Joe, what would be different? He tells me that he would be dating again. Now, when he dates, he gets really anxious. He gets really anxious because his last girlfriend cheated on him and dumped him for another guy. And that was horrific for him. It was so painful for him, he fell into a depression. So you see what the secondary gain is here? His mind, his body is telling him, okay, stay depressed, be depressed because of your dog dying, okay? Because if you weren't depressed, you would have to be out there with your buddies, looking for girlfriends, maybe even getting a girlfriend. Once you get the girlfriend, she's gonna cheat on you, and she's gonna dump you, and you're gonna suffer. So instead of going through all that pain, why don't you just stay depressed? So you see that depression that the person is feeling in the moment is not the real problem. The real problem is the fear of dating. So my friends, I've explained to you what secondary gain is, what emotion as a distraction is, okay? Remember, it's the emotion that you're feeling now, but that's not the real thing, the real problem. Ask yourself a big question. What if I didn't have this problem today? And maybe you could get to something deeper. You could get to a real fear of something happening if you weren't depressed, if you weren't anxious, if you weren't angry. And that's the thing you need to work on. So Sarah, for example, she doesn't need to work on her depression, on her anxiety about leaving the house. No, Sarah needs to go visit her mother so that she can get over the fear of visiting her mother, of seeing her transition, of her depression that she feels she's going to get if she sees her mother look really bad because of the cancer. So Sarah needs to go visit her mother, expose herself to the situation. She's going to see that it's not going to be so bad, not as bad as she's making it up to be. Once she does that, the anxiety that she was feeling about leaving the house, the anxiety she was feeling about getting on the subway is going to disappear because that was just a distraction. Joe, he needs to go out there and date. And that's right, and meet a girl. And he needs to expose himself to rejection. He needs to expose himself to dating. He needs to expose himself to the situation that was making him scared in the first place. And once he does that, he's not going to be depressed no more because the depression is just a distraction. it's not real. Once he starts dating women, he's not going to be depressed anymore, because the depression has no reason in his life anymore. He may be scared, about falling in love and being hurt again, but that's okay. That's a fear we all have, and we overcome by exposing ourselves to the situation. So today we talked about emotion as a distraction. So my friends, whenever you're feeling some sort of unhealthy, negative emotion, ask yourself, what if I didn't have this? How would my life be? And then you might get to something a little deeper. Understand? Great. My name is Marcos, and please visit thejovinstitute.org. Live healthy and live happy, and I'll see you here next time.